Our very last section of topic 1 deals with humans and pollution. And the two significant ideas are that pollution is a highly diverse phenomenon of human disturbance in ecosystems, and pollution management strategies can be applied at different levels. So we're going to look at that first bullet point in this video, and we'll talk about pollution management strategies in class. So the definition of pollution is the addition of a substance or agent to an environment through human activity. So it's something that we are introducing to the environment. And the key thing is that it is at a rate greater than which the environment can process it or be rendered harmless. So it also has an appreciable effect on the organisms in the environment. So a harmful effect on not just humans, but the other organisms in the ecosystems as well. Some of the major sources of pollutants, one of the biggest is our combustion of fossil fuels, whether it's for energy, in industry, or transportation. The second is domestic waste, so that's the trash that we throw away on a daily basis. Industrial waste, that's the waste produced that goes into producing our products, both the things that we use and the food that we eat. Agricultural waste, would include the runoff from agricultural fields, any sewage from the lagoons at hog farms, or runoff from feedlots in our CAFOs, which are our large livestock operations. All right, so pollutants can fall into one of four categories. They are either matter, energy, biological agents, or invasive species. And on the previous slide, we looked at some of the sources of the pollutants, the biggest one being the combustion of fossil fuels. And one of the issues with a lot of our pollutants, a lot of times we don't know it's a problem until it's too late, because there's a time lag between when the pollutant is introduced and when we see the effect on the organisms. All right, so our first category was matter. These can be solid, liquid, or gas pollutants, and they can be classified as either organic or inorganic. Organic pollutants are derived from living things, which means they contain carbon. So sewage from our sewage treatment plants, food would fall into that category. And then our inorganic pollutants like plastics or heavy metals like mercury and arsenic. A lot of times we don't think of energy as being pollution, but light pollution, a lot of times in urban areas you can't look up and see as many stars at night as you could if you were in a rural area because of the city lights. Sound is a type of energy. We have noise pollution. If you live near an airport, if you live near large wind turbines, then you're going to experience noise pollution. And the third type of energy pollution is thermal or heat pollution. Cooling water for a lot of our power plants is released into lakes, which can create issues in those marine ecosystems. Okay, biological agents. These are our bacteria, viruses, fungi, and mold. It can be pollen, which we know creates some respiratory issues certain times of the year. Animal dander, if you're allergic to cats or other animals. And dust mites, which are these teeny tiny little organisms that live in your carpet, your mattresses, your sheets, and they feed on the dead skin cells that you shed every day. All right, our next category are invasive species. These are organisms that are not native to a specific habitat, and they are either introduced on purpose or accidentally, but they take over the role of other organisms and damage the environment. One example is kudzu. This is a common plant in our area. It was native to Japan, and it was brought over on purpose to use as a decorative plant. However, it takes over everything because it has no natural consumers to control it. You've probably seen this vine growing on the sides of roads, over trees, over abandoned cars. It can attach to anything. Another example is the Burmese python. These were imported to the U.S. as pets, and then what would happen is when they would get too large, people would release them. So these snakes have really taken over in the Everglades and have disrupted the food webs, the balance in the ecosystem. They actually have contests certain times of the year who can catch and kill the most of these pythons. The third are the cane toads, and we will talk about cane toads later on this year, but these are native to Central America and were introduced on purpose in Australia to kill the cane beetles on the sugar plantations. However, once again, because they have no natural predator, they tended to flourish and now are spreading across Australia and creating all sorts of issues. And you can see from the picture, these are very large toads. All right, when we classify pollutants, there are 4 different ways they can be classified, and we'll look at the differences with each of these. They can be point source or non-point source, persistent or biodegradable, acute or chronic, and primary or secondary. A point source pollution arises from a single, clearly identifiable source. So if you can see where the pollution is coming from. So a pipe from a sewage treatment plant that is dumping liquid into a river. You can see the actual point from where it's coming from. So point source pollution, because it has a single source, is easier to manage and also tends to have a smaller, more localized impact. Non-point source pollution comes from numerous widely dispersed origins. For example, it can be stormwater runoff. So water runs off of the roads, the yards, into the storm drains, and if there's pollution in that water, you don't know which yard it came from. Water runoff from urban areas, water runoff from agricultural fields. Air pollution can also be considered non-point source if it's not coming from a single smokestack. So because it comes from widely dispersed sources, it's much more difficult to identify and therefore harder to manage because you cannot assign responsibility for the pollution. Persistent versus biodegradable. We've talked about POPs, or persistent organic pollutants. Those are pollutants that resist breaking down, usually because they are not water soluble. And because of this, they remain active in the environment for a long time. They can bioaccumulate in the fatty tissues of animals and humans. Therefore, they can lead to biomagnification in our food chain. Some examples are DDT, PCBs, and dioxins. DDTs are pesticides. PCBs are used in transformers, and dioxins are used in herbicides and also the bleaching process of paper. We'll take a closer look at DDT in class as well. Biodegradable pollutants, on the other hand, are capable of being broken down by biological processes. So sewage, compost, starches, soap, these are water soluble and can break down either from heat, light, decomposers, so they don't remain in the environment creating problems for long periods of time. All right, acute versus chronic. Acute is when large amounts of a pollutant are released in one time, causing a lot of harm. So one example that we'll look at is the Bhopal disaster in India. The Deepwater Horizon incident in the Gulf of Mexico would be another example. Whereas chronic is when you have a long-term release of small amounts of a pollutant. The problem with this is that it often goes undetected for a long period of time. It's harder to clean up, it spreads widely. An example would be air pollution causing chronic respiratory diseases like asthma, emphysema, bronchitis, and this is an issue in Beijing. All right, then our last comparison is primary versus secondary pollutants. Primary pollutants are active as soon as they are emitted. So one example would be carbon monoxide, which comes from the incomplete combustion of fossil fuels. So cars release carbon monoxide, and it can cause headaches, fatigue, and even death if you're exposed to too much. A secondary pollutant arises when a primary pollutant undergoes a physical or chemical change. So sulfuric acid forms when sulfur trioxide reacts with water. The formation of smog, which is made of nitrogen dioxide, is a chemical reaction that occurs close to the ground. And so these are called secondary pollutants because a chemical reaction takes place before it's harmful. All right, so we will look at some pollution management strategies in class and take a closer look at DDT and some of its impacts.